Chapter 19 of The Man with the Red Beard by David Whitelaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne. Chapter 19. I See Felix in London. No word was said until the door was securely fastened behind us, then only a few muttered sentences in Russian between the woman and Monsieur Ballas. What their purport was I could only guess by the glances thrown to me by the former as she listened to what the rat had to say. The hall we were standing in was a square, well-built one, roomy and lofty; indeed, as far as I could see, the house was a far larger one than I had thought from the outside. There was no light save the speck of gas and the candle which the old woman had set down upon the carved oak table, and perhaps the gloom which filled the corners made the hall appear more spacious than it really was. A wide carpeted staircase led to the upper floors, but this too was in darkness. From somewhere at the back came the muffled sound of tapping, and I was conscious of an odour of cooking that reminded me painfully of the restaurant I had lately left. Bellis turned to me as the woman opened a door on our left, and held it for me to enter, following me and turning up an incandescent burner when I had done so. "You will wait here, Monsieur Drawfo," he said. "There are a few—I had better see those who are here before I take you up. There are papers," and he pointed to a round table on which were a few magazines. Left to myself, I investigated my surroundings. The room, like the hall, was lofty and well built. The moulding of the ceiling and the heavy marble mantelpiece told me that the house had been put up long before the days of the jerry builder. Indeed, the whole place gave one the impression of mid-Victorian glories. There were two long windows reaching from the ceiling to within a foot of the floor, and in the space between them a mirror heavily framed in tarnished gilt scroll-work showed my figure at full length. I parted the long lace curtains. Outside the windows ran a little iron-railed balcony, very narrow, and looking more as though built for decoration or as a resting place for plants than to be stood upon. I saw, too, that the windows were fitted with rather large brass catch fasteners, and that heavy wooden shutters folded up into the panelling on either side of them. By their weight, as I tried them, I suspected they must have been lined with metal. That they, as well as the window catches, were of very modern workmanship I had no doubt. The furnishings of the apartment were shabby genteel and depressing, horsehair and what-nots, and antimacassars. They all reminded me of nothing in the world so much as a dentist's waiting-room, a simile to which the dog-eared magazines on the round mahogany table lent colour. The pictures were unimportant, an engraving or two, with here and there an indifferent oil-painting. An enormous gilt clock under the glass dome on the mantel-shelf, I saw, had stopped at 9:15. I took stock of myself in the mirror between the windows. I had taken Winson's advice and darkened my hair considerably, thereby accentuating the grey over the ears. My pince-nez alone added 10 years to my appearance. Also, by a happy thought, I had had minute pieces of gold fillings set between my front teeth. I am particularly blessed in the matter of teeth, and I feared that my moustache was hardly sufficient to hide them. These fillings, suggesting as they did decayed teeth, should disarm anyone who saw in Simon Drawfo the least resemblance to Sammy Mannering. I managed the little operation without the aid of a dentist, and I could remove the little pieces of soft gold as I pleased. It was a quarter of an hour or 20 minutes before Ballas returned. He had with him a tall man of perhaps 50 years of age. It seemed to me that he showed some little hesitation at accepting what the rat had doubtless told him, for he looked at me sharply. I think, however, that my appearance went in my favour. Dr. Muraudon, for it was by that name and title the man was introduced to me, asked me many questions, touching very little, happily, upon Geneva. Indeed, I saw immediately, from even my limited knowledge of the Swiss city, that he knew it not at all. On Russian subjects, thanks to what I had learnt from Bergstoff and what I had myself seen and suffered, I think I satisfied him. I kept my card of membership to the last as a trump card. As the man figured the little square of yellow pasteboard stamped with the circle and inverted triangle of the Brotherhood, I knew that all doubt had left him. He questioned me about my prison life, and on this subject I did not have to resort to any invention. My description of life in a Russian gaol was, at any rate, a reality. I accounted for still possessing my membership card by telling the first lie that entered my head, and saying that, at Bergstoff's suggestion, I had hidden it in my room at the hotel before going to the fatal meeting at the flat. Upon my return to Moscow 6 months later, I had engaged the same room, and luckily found my card still hidden behind the wainscoting where I had put it. Altogether my story in its little details was so convincing that I believe for the moment I really thought myself to be Simon Draffo. Had my listener doubted me, I think I would have felt offended. But he did not doubt me, and in a few moments he opened the door and asked me to accompany him. My introduction to the others gathered in the Norwood house took place in a room on the floor above, a back room with big bow windows closely curtained with heavy red draperies. In the embrasure of this window 3 men sat at a square table, a little heap of papers and a chair that had been pushed back, showing where the middle-aged man who had questioned me had been sitting when he was called away by Ballas to welcome their brother, Simon Draffo. I gave a hasty glance at the faces that looked up from their papers at our entrance. One of them I had seen before, that belonging to a heavily built, short man, with black hair parted on one side close above the ear, and falling in a long wave across his rather intellectual forehead. I remembered him perfectly as one of the men I had seen at Felix Merzev's flat on the night of the raid. The man looked at me, I thought, somewhat intently, and I bowed. The recognition, I told myself, should come from me. That would be proof positive that I had been present at the flat. "I have seen monsieur," I said pleasantly. "It was on the night when— May I be permitted to congratulate monsieur on his fortunate escape?" The 2 other men at the table merely bowed as I was introduced to them. In their faces I read no sign of recognition, and it was evident that, for them, Simon Draffo had no particular significance. What had been the subject under discussion when my arrival interrupted them, I could not say. Whatever it was shelved, and the conversation became general, of Russia mostly, and of the events that had recently been taking place there. We spoke a great deal, too, of the debacle at the flat. Indeed, when possible, I turned the subject on to that comparatively safe ground. I imagined that the knowledge, palpably first-hand, that I possessed of the affair must have done much to dispel any lingering doubts any of the party may have had as to my bona fides. It was evident, however, that I was not to be included in their council, and it was evident also that they were only waiting for my departure to proceed with their business. Simon Draffo, as a member of their organization, was assured of a courteous welcome, but it was not necessary that they should trust him with the affair they had in hand. When, a little later on, I discovered that business, I was not surprised at the care they took over its discussion. The thick-set man, particularly, seemed to be impatient. He sat and drummed his fingers, thick square-topped fingers, on the table with ill-concealed irritation, and fidgeted with the papers before him. I tried to gather something from the glimpse I could get from where I sat of the documents, but beyond that there was a plan of some building among them, I was unsuccessful. At intervals I could catch the sound of the tapping I had heard as we stood in the hall. It was, perhaps, a few minutes after midnight when the Rat and I made our way back to town. We were too late for a train, but we happened upon a returning cab, and, after dropping Ballas at Shaftesbury Avenue, I reached my hotel a little after 1 o'clock, fairly well satisfied with my evening's experience. The next day, after breakfast, I again took the journey to Norwood, this time alone, and in a suit other than that I had worn the evening before. I had no fixed programme as to what I intended doing, but I had a fancy to see the mysterious house with the steel shutters by daylight. I had little difficulty in locating the house, and whatever had been my previous impressions, there was nothing sinister about the place seeing it as I did now, in the genial sunlight of a summer morning. The name painted in white letters on the top rail of the gate was Carina Villa. The life of a prosperous suburb passed up and down before the house. Tradesmen, nursemaids with their charges, errand boys, all went by with never a look up the gravel path that wound among the evergreens. The events of the night seemed far away as I stood for a moment reading the small brass plate affixed to the gate, setting forth that Dr. Murdern received pupils in foreign languages. A good cloak, judging from the lack of interest shown by the inhabitants of Norwood in the villa and its affairs. So far, I had said, as I walked on, so good. I had obtained a footing in the home of the London section. It remained now to find Myra, and, after her, Merzef. I do not know quite which meeting I looked forward to with the greatest pleasure. There was a public-house some 6 doors away, and nearly opposite the house, and it was the sight of the billiard-room, which I noticed was on the first floor, which gave me an idea. As well, I said, to pass my time in the neighbourhood as at my hotel in Bloomsbury. I might perhaps see Myra, if, as I half expected, she visited the house. My ruse was a simple one. I was a foreigner, I told the landlord, staying in the neighbourhood, and I was desirous of mastering the intricacies of the English pocket game of billiards, perhaps I could hire the table by the afternoon. And so, after lunch each day for the next week, I occupied the room above the bar of the public-house. I am afraid my practice with the cue was rather desultory, but I do not think I missed much of what was passing at Carina Villa. The elderly woman who had admitted us the night before passed in and out, presumably from the basket on her arm. She was shopping. Dr. Murden himself took an hour's walk each afternoon, generally between 3 and 4 o'clock. Apart from the thick-set man whom I had seen in Moscow, nobody seemed to visit the villa, and the postman's visits were very rare. If Dr. Murden received any pupils, I did not see them enter or leave his house. At last my vigil grew monotonous, and I had decided upon the abandonment of my study of billiards, when my patience was rewarded, curiously enough on a Sunday when my ruse was not in operation. I had, however, gone out to Norwood as usual, intending to force matters a little by calling upon the doctor. I remembered that he held out an invitation of sorts to me upon my visit with Bellas, an invitation I had not as yet availed myself of. My plans, however, did not materialize. As I approached the villa, I caught sight of 2 figures standing at the gate. One was the doctor. The other, although he had his back towards me, I named for Felix Merzef. To step into the friendly shelter of the gateway was but the work of a moment, and I stood there, feasting my eyes upon the figure of my enemy, waiting for the men to separate. As I looked at the evil face as he half turned to bid Dr. Murden good-bye, and at the hateful red beard of him, all that this man had done for me passed through my brain, searing it with hatred. The treachery at the flat, the taunts in the prison in Moscow, where I had had the short-lived satisfaction of feeling my fingers at his throat, the 6 months of hell under the brutality of Azanoff, the deception he had practised on one who was more to me than my life, all these things came back to me, and I remembered what I had said to him in Moscow as to the account being a long one when settlement came. The settlement, I said, was very near now. Here, too, was my chance for the supreme test as to my altered appearance, and what was it that the rat had said to me, that where Myra was, Merzef would not be far off? Time enough for my revenge when the man who had unwittingly led me to the girl whose whereabouts were previous so hard to trace. The chase, when at last the men separated, was a long one, and the following of Merzef no easy matter. After bowing and raising his hat to the professor of languages, he walked leisurely down the road in the direction of the station. The way lay straight, and on this summer afternoon was almost devoid of traffic, a more difficult tracking ground, and one with less cover than a typical suburban road on a Sunday afternoon it would perhaps be difficult to find. I knew that Felix Merzef would look with suspicion upon any one who seemed to take an undue interest in his movements. Moreover, should that person appear by his clothes to be a foreigner, those suspicions would be increased tenfold. I was careful, then, that the test I wished to put was not attempted in this neighbourhood. I saw that the long road could lead only to the station, and I decided upon losing sight of my quarry for a little, and getting ahead of him by hurrying through side streets, of which I had knowledge. I had estimated right, for I had not been on the platform 5 minutes before friend Felix entered the booking-hall, and when a few minutes later he entered a train for Victoria, I, unperceived, chose the adjacent compartment. End of chapter 19.